Thanks, Michael. I did mention to you through the week that the theme that I'd be looking at today was the great God of surprises. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. But I just want to briefly talk about, in the life of Jesus, the longest day. Now, I'm not going to talk about the 4th of June 1944 when the Allies invaded France to finish the end of World War II. I'm not. That was called the longest day, but this is the longest day in the life of Jesus. Jesus had just been told of the death of his cousin, cruelly executed, not because he had committed some civil crime, but because of some fantasy of a very evil lady. And so he lost his cousin. They were around about the same age. And so in the prime of his life, John was taken. Prior to that, Jesus had sent the disciples out on some homework. They'd had all the oral, and now it was some of the practical work that they had to do. And he was looking forward to chatting with them and hearing their stories. Carolyn's now going to bring us the first part of our reading this morning. It's from Matthew 14, from verses 13 to 21. Thanks, Carolyn.
As soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "That isn't necessary. You feed them." "But we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes." They answered. "Bring them here," he said. Then he told the people to sit down on the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, looked up toward heaven and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to his disciples, who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children.
Thanks, Carolyn. Are they real or? Oh, isn't that lovely, mate? Thank you. I just noticed them. I had to come from this angle to see them, but they're lovely. Thank you. Who likes surprises? Hey, surprises aren't too bad, are they? But sometimes surprises are not nice. I've been thinking about this morning, and I didn't know whether to, but I could tell an anecdote which puts me in a very bad light. It probably makes you feel, oh, what a creep you are. But at any rate, you probably know that at any rate. So, okay. In my 20s, I used to smoke, like everybody else did around me. 90% of the people did in those days. And I was working in the works department, and my work colleagues were all older guys. I was the youngest guy there. Some of them were returned servicemen and so on. But at any rate, I couldn't afford to buy tailor-mades, so I used to roll my own. So I'd buy Champion Ruby Ready Rubbed, and it was in a pouch with a pack of papers with it, and I'd leave that on the desk there. Well, one of the guys kept on coming up and saying, "Hey, mate, how about a ciggy?" And I'd say, "Help yourself." So he would. That wasn't too bad. But that went on for day after day. And it was getting me a little bit concerned, because I thought, hang on, I'm not buying smokes for him too. So I thought, well, I'm going to fix you. So what I did, I made a cigarette. But what I did, I cut off 2 match heads and put it in the middle. That's a terrible thing to do, isn't it? You know? So I rolled the cigarette and put it on the top of the tobacco. And I knew Alf would come up. And he'd come up and say, hey, mate, how about a ciggy? I said, look, Alf, I got one rolled there for you. Why don't you take that? Well, I'd already told some of the other guys. And we were all waiting. But I put it in the middle, so I thought the flash won't hurt his face and it'll take him a while to get into it. So anyway, by the time it went off, just went off in flares and smoke and yes, and some fire. And he jumped about 10 feet in the air. But what I should have thought of, he was a returned serviceman who'd been on the Burma Railroad. So any noise used to frighten the tripe out of him. And he used to get so scared. And he chased me. And I think he would have caught me, he would have killed me. But anyway, I was young at that time and I could get away. So I apologised to him later. But I thought about it later on. I thought, you creep, you know. He had no respect for these guys. So that wasn't a surprise for him, wasn't it? Jesus was so looking forward to just sharing with the disciples. And you know what it's like when you do something and you want to get together and talk. And so this is the surprise too. He said to the disciples, where's the boat? Here. Well, let's go. We'll go over to the other side where it's deserted and it's not too many people around there and we can have a chat. Well, trouble is some of the people who were around, there's never without people around Jesus, wasn't it? They heard what he said. So they hot-footed it around the coast. And of course, when Jesus got over the other side, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't lonely. It wasn't deserted. It was full of people. Last thing probably that Jesus wanted. Now, the scriptures tell us that when Jesus saw them, he had compassion. Now, that word wouldn't have come into my mind if I was doing what Jesus was doing. The last thing I would have wanted was to see a mob of people wanting me to do something to help them. Having people like that was having a boil. I had no patience with anything like that because I was wanting to have this time with Jesus and with my disciples, and I was looking forward to this so much, and I was going through grief. And anyway, he had compassion. So then we come to the disciples. Now, the disciples were looking at the sky, and it was getting a little bit darker. And by this time, the crowd had swelled because they'd picked up people on the towns on the way through. Now there is it says in the scriptures 5,000 men, but that would have been very conservative because with women and children would have been close to 7,000 people there gathered around. So the disciples very timidly probably went up to the master. Don't forget, Jesus is the master. And they suggested, now, Lord, you look at the sky, it's getting a little bit dark. These people haven't brought anything with them. You better send them away so they can get something to eat. Very, very thoughtful of the disciples, wasn't it? You know? They were thinking of the people. And so Jesus turned to them and said, you feed them. Well, the Jerusalem Times recorded that the dropping of the jaws of 12 disciples as it hit the ground reverberated so much so that at the temple, the people in charge of the temple who were overcharging and exploiting all the people couldn't do it for a couple of minutes because of this noise. That wasn't in the scripture, I tell you. But it's Ron's version. And then, of course, Jesus, I think he must have had a wicked sense of humour. He knew what he was going to do. He knew all along that he didn't. How? And the disciples, as they stood there with their jaws and their faces, they were Mediterranean people, and so they would have been olive skinned, but now they're all white and ashen with fear and checking their pockets to see how much money. How are we going to pay the 5,000 people? How are we going to get the bread and stuff? They must have been going through their mind. And then Jesus said to them, he put them out of their misery. He's so lovely. That's what Jesus does, isn't it? And he said, go and check and see what's amongst the crowd. Then surely there'll be something there. So they go around, and all they could bring back was one guy who was given by his mum 5 loaves and 3 fish. Now, I don't know what that mum thought. He must have been a great big guy. Because could you eat 5 loaves and 3 fish for lunch? I don't know. But at any rate, he might have been pretty hungry. So I don't know whether he willingly gave it up to the disciples or whether they twisted his arm or what, but they gave that to Jesus. And Jesus, first of all, prayed to God and blessed it and distributed it. And so they had enough food. Everybody said they had enough and more than enough to eat. Wasn't that wonderful that they had so much to eat? So much so that they had 12 baskets left. Now, what I want to know is, who got the baskets? That's right. That's the question everybody wants to know. Who got the leftovers? When you go to a party or something like that and somebody offers you leftovers, you never say no, do you? You're always going to take them home. So who got the leftovers? We don't know. Renee, you're going to read us the next part of the story, and it comes from verse 22, the same chapter. Thank you.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "Oh, you of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when he climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed.
Thanks, Renee. Now, don't forget, this is still the same day. This is still the same day. So what happens now? The first word in verse 22 says immediately. Why? Why immediately did the disciples have to go in the boat? I'll tell you why. Because the crowd were now looking for a necktie party. Not Jesus. You know what the necktie parties are? That's mob control and mob violence generally, but this wasn't going to be mob violence. It was going to be mob love. Because they wanted to grab Jesus and make him their king. Who wouldn't? He's healed them and he's fed them. What more can you want? He's the God of surprises, isn't he? He's given them a feed with 12 baskets over from 3 fish and 5 loaves. Incredible stuff. And so he did not want the disciples caught up with this. So he sent them off on the boat. And the people went away and he went out to pray. Now, the scriptures tell us that a tempest came up, the wind very strong, and the waves were high, and it was probably in danger of swamping the boat that the disciples were in. They were terrified because their sails were useless and they couldn't row. They were at the mercy of the elements. And then all of a sudden, in the gloom and in the howling of the wind and everything, they saw something. First of all, they thought it was a ghost. But then as they got closer, or as that thing, that spectre, come closer, they could see it was a person. And then Jesus was recognized by Peter. He said, "It's the Lord. It's the Lord." Now, I thought about this. How else could Jesus get there but walk on the water? What could he do? There was no other dinghy left on the island that they were on the side of the lake that they were on, so he couldn't row out. He could have done his miraculous stuff and just placed himself in the boat. He could have swum. I couldn't imagine that happening. Nobody could swim in those days, basically. So what did he do? He walked on the water. Now, the waves were so terrible that you would imagine that it'd be impossible. But because it was Jesus walking on the water was like a pavement for him to walk on. It was so smooth in front of Jesus. And as the disciples saw him coming closer, it was Peter. It was Peter. He said, "It's the Lord." And so straight away, he did the bravest act that I've ever read about in the Bible. He put his feet over the edge of that boat and got into the water. Did he know that he was going to be saved and walk across the water? No. Did he know that he was able to swim over to Jesus? No, he couldn't swim. But he got out just the same because he wanted to be with Jesus. What desperation makes him want to be with Jesus, and what desperation makes you and I want to get with Jesus so that we don't care about the consequences. As soon as he put his feet into that water, he could have sunk to the bottom. Gone. He didn't know. Did he care? No. And so Jesus allowed him that miracle that he was able to walk on the water towards Jesus, and Jesus was walking towards him. But then, of course, we read that all of a sudden Peter began to sink. See, there's two miracles there, and there's two surprises, isn't there? Jesus walking on the water and Peter being able to walk on the water also. But unless we continue to have our eyes focused on Jesus, when the storms of life come to us, we're going to see all the things that are around us and all the things that we can't do and all the things that are going to happen to us, and so we're going to sink too. And Peter took his eyes off Jesus and began to sink. And so he called out to him, "Lord, Lord, save me." And Jesus kept on walking and reached out his hand and pulled him back up. Oh, he said, "Peter, what happened to your faith? Your faith was so strong when you got out of that boat, wasn't it? And yet now, what happened? But here's my hand." And Jesus is no different today. He's putting out his hand to each one of us when we come to our strife and our troubles and situations of distress and sorrow and anguish. He's putting out his hand to pull us out of that problem too, isn't he? Because that's what Jesus does. And so when they got into the boat, what does the scriptures say about each one of those in the boat? That they was so angry that the storm was going? No. It says they worshipped him. They worshipped him. So when Jesus got back over to the other side, it was still nearly the same day. It might be a little bit more than 24 hours, but the same situation. Crowds were waiting. Crowds heard him coming and he healed them and preached to them. There's one psalm that Karen's going to read to us now. And it won't be Psalm 139, but it'll be verses 7 to 12 of it. And this is something that I really love, and I'm sure it will help you also.
I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell by the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me and your strength will support me. I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night. But even in the darkness, I cannot hide from you. To you, the night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you.
Thank you. Does that give you encouragement as it does me? Doesn't matter, does it? As the psalmist says, in the deepest waters you come to them. And so it is that Jesus surprises us continually. Surprises us with his love. And you know why he does that? Because he cares. He cares. And you know, even on the way to the cross, when he must have had so much on his mind and so much trauma and anguish that he had to face, and so much pain and suffering, on the road to Jerusalem on that same day, Jesus cared. He cared because two blind men saw him coming and called out to him. And the crowd tried to stop him. In Matthew 20, you'll read the story. They said, "Be quiet." But that didn't make any difference. They just yelled louder. Jesus said, "Then what do you want?" And they said, "We want to be healed." And so Jesus, on his way to Jerusalem to the crucifixion, he had time to walk over and touch the eyes of these lepers, of these blind men, and heal them. It's no different today. Jesus has got time for each one of us because he cares. But sometimes we say, "Well, what can I do for you, Lord? I can't do much." I've got a little saying, Nick, that you might be able to put up. And I know Michael always comes up with a good one. I'm only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do. And the last line, which I didn't have, says, but what I can do, I will do by God's grace. Edward Everett. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Ron.